Welcome to this episode of Rattling the Bars. Most people in America, sometime in the past, have heard the name Willie Horton. He represented really bad news for lifers. Well, there's a similar guy that represents bad news for juvenile lifers. His name is Kip Kinkel. And recently, and he hasn't spoken for like decades, recently he decided to give an interview. And so he gave an interview to Jessica Schulberg and for the Huffington Post. And she joins me today to kind of give us a overview and a rundown on this particular case. Jessica, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Jessica, can you give us an overview of why this case is so important to tens of thousands of people?
Sure. So the backstory is that in 1998, when Kip was 15 years old, he shot and killed both of his parents, 2 boys at his school, and wounded 25 others. He was soon after diagnosed with schizophrenia and received medication and therapy that helped treat the voices and the delusions and the things that most immediately contributed to his crime. But because of how high profile the crime was and how infamous he was within the community, his lawyers encouraged him to take a plea deal instead of pursuing an insanity defense. The way that plea deal shook out, Kip got 112 years without parole in prison, so essentially a juvenile life without parole sentence. This was sort of made possible because of some really tough on crime mandatory minimums for juveniles that were passed in 1994, sort of during the height of the super predator fear-mongering era. And since then, every time there's been an effort to repeal these tough on crime mandatory minimums for juveniles, Kip is often brought up as the reason why we actually need to preserve that ability in Oregon to punish some kids for life without parole.
Okay, it seems that there's no other nation in the world that gives juveniles, that's the people under 18, life without parole. Is that true? And why then is it America that's doing that?
It's definitely true, at least in statute. I wouldn't be shocked if there's some kids in other places that end up facing that punishment. But in terms of a statute, the US is the only one that legally has on the books a juvenile life without parole sentence. And in terms of why, I think that fits in with a broader question of why do we over-incarcerate and over-punish people in the way that we do more broadly. But I think as it pertains to juveniles, I think we can trace a lot of that back to the 80s and 90s and the fear-mongering around the super predator and this sort of racist fantasy that there are these, I think John DeLuglio described them as godless, fatherless sons in these urban cities who are going to kill just for the thrill of killing. They have no motivation. They're just possessed by this desire to commit violence. And that narrative sort of took off and was used to just justify increasingly harsher and harsher sentencing. And people sort of started to think, well, what's the big deal at 18? If a 17-year-old murders somebody, then aren't they basically old enough to be treated as an adult? And then you can sort of see how there's a slippery slope. And if 17 is old enough, then is 16 old enough, and is 15 old enough? And we all know how particularly Black youth and youth of color are often sort of adultified and viewed as much older than they are, which is, I think, used to justify this type of sentencing.
What I found interesting is that unlike the Willie Horton case, which they use him as the poster boy for life without parole for anyone receiving a life sentence with or without parole. Now, what I find interesting about Kip's case is that, as you said, in the 90s, the 80s, the 90s, there was this whole thing about super predators, young Black men, teenagers wilding out, going crazy, this and that they should be 3 strikes you out and all that. But then I find that Kip up in Oregon in almost a completely white environment, with the luxury of owning hundreds, well, not hundreds, but guns, you know, he becomes that poster boy. Uh, and it seems like when they started executions again, they stuck up a white guy. And people said, oh, well, it can't be all that bad, you know, and so it's okay. Uh, and, but now Kip is this poster boy for life without parole for juveniles, but the overwhelming juvenile population is Black. Is that not true? And not why is that? I guess you know why it is. But talk about that a little bit, because it seems like a distortion of what really is going on by using Kip's case like they use it.
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, Oregon is overwhelmingly, disproportionately, extremely white. So I think there are more white juveniles facing long sentences in Oregon specifically, but it's not proportionate. I think I have in the story that Black youth were 26 times more likely to be indicted on a Measure 11 offense, and Measure 11 is that measure that passed in 1994 that gave mandatory minimums to juveniles. So from the outset, Black youth were much, much more likely in terms of population representation to be charged with these types of crimes. And that disparity only got worse over time. It only became more true that Black youth were disproportionately targeted under this stuff. But I think you are right that nationwide, when you leave Oregon and you're not looking at such an overwhelmingly white state, Black youth do make up about, I believe, half of juvenile life without parole cases, despite that being nowhere near the population that Black youth make up. I think the reason for it, I think there's a few ways to look at it. I think that Kip's case was so high profile and horrifying. President Bill Clinton came out to his town and spoke with the victims and their families. This was the year before Columbine, when there was sort of a string of school shootings, and people were just starting to think that this might be something that we need to really start being afraid of. And so I think just how high profile and how public Kip became, it made it easier to justify. You have to take or create somebody who becomes this public villain. And Kip was already sort of there. And then I think the fact that he's been quiet for so long has allowed people to sort of weaponize his image and his existence to make him out to be this type of unrepentant, unsavable monster that is then used to justify really extreme punishment for a bunch of other people who nobody's ever heard of. Which I should add is why Kip eventually decided to speak with me, as he saw how his name was being propped up to justify not giving other juveniles a chance to prove that they had been reformed and rehabilitated and that they don't pose a threat to society. And some of these people who he saw being held back because of him are some of his really close friends who helped him sort of come to terms with his diagnosis and learn how to build, to the extent possible, within a very violent and dehumanizing environment, build sort of a pro-social community is how he describes it.
This brings me to this question about him. Not only after 20 years he decided to do an interview, but he's changed. I don't know whether you work magic with your pen or typewriter or what, but he changed so much. I mean, he's the kind of person that you talk about him a little bit. You did hours of interviews. Talk about how he changed and how he have grown.
Mm-hmm. So we've spoken for about 20 hours over the course of 10 months. So about a year. It was all during the pandemic. So it was all over the phone. I couldn't go visit him because visiting was shut down. I don't know that I'm the best positioned person to speak about how he's changed, since I never met him as a child, but I can say now that he's kind of just an incredible human being, to put it succinctly. He's very kind. He's very compassionate. He's a very good listener. He's very thoughtful. You can tell that when he's talking to me, particularly about his crimes and about the harm that he's caused, he's always sort of so meticulous and deliberate about making sure that it's clear that he accepts responsibility for what he did and that he understands the harm that he's caused. But also, he's very thoughtful about all the factors that contributed to his crime, both a lack of understanding about mental illness, just the availability of the guns, the fact that he had such ready access to guns, the fact that he grew up in this very white pro-gun culture where, if he was able to get a ride to a gun show, he could buy some literature that was warning of these foreign invaders who are going to come and take your guns, which kind of lined up with what these hallucinations and the delusions that he was experiencing as a result of his untreated schizophrenia. One thing I thought was really interesting is I emailed briefly with Kip's older sister, who has always stood by him and always been a really incredible source of support for him. And I asked her to tell me what changes she had observed in Kip over the years. And she said, I don't think change is the right word. Like, I see a lot of growth, but I just see him growing into the person that he always has been. He's always been really compassionate. He's always been very sensitive. He's always been very hard on himself when he has a shortcoming. And now that he has, she said the only thing that's really changed is that we have an understanding of what his illness is and we know how to treat it. And we've been doing so successfully for a long time, which allows him to be the person that she always knew him to be growing up.
Well, one of the things that concerned me, I think, is that in Oregon they passed a law, and it would allow juveniles without life, or without parole, life of parole, without parole, obviously to go back and have their case looked at and given a second chance and so on. And after it passed, there was some pushback, but I don't know from where, the community, the legislation, etc., about Kip being able to take advantage of this. And that was the scenario, the narrative anyway, is like, he's going to get out. We had a similar case like that here in Maryland with Unger. And it was like hundreds of people got out. And Unger is the only one still in jail. The law that got hundreds of people out based on his case, and he's still in jail. And then it looks like this is the case with Kip. A law based on the way they did not consider all the factors and consider giving him a second chance, now has a clause in it that says he can't take advantage of it because his case predates the law. But it's also impacting all of his friends and so on. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so when the reform bills first started to be sort of debated, when there was this working group to look at basically how to undo Measure 11, which was that 1994 mandatory minimum statute that applied to juveniles, it was pretty contentious from the outset as to whether or not it would be retroactive. And the kind of compromise wording that ended up getting passed in that first version of the bill is that the bill would apply to anybody who gets sentenced on or after the date of the bill going into effect. So it wasn't fully retroactive from the beginning, but what it meant is that if Kip or any other juvenile life without parole person, if their case came up for resentencing, which is becoming increasingly common as the Supreme Court issues, well, until recently, the Supreme Court was issuing good rulings for juvenile lifers. So it was, if a case came up for resentencing, they should get resentenced under these new parameters in Oregon. So it was never even really a slam dunk for Kip. It was never going to be like Kip could just go to the parole board and be like, hey, like, I'm juvenile life, like, that's not right. It was always sort of a very complicated, difficult, long shot for him and anybody who was already incarcerated to benefit from this bill. But it did hold out some sliver of hope. And I should add that Kip and all of his friends were really instrumental in getting the bill passed. They were meeting in private with lawmakers and various community stakeholders to talk about why this bill was important and to sort of show their own growth and their own concept of accountability. And yeah, throughout that process, Kip was constantly held up as a reason not to pass the bill. I spoke with people who are friends with him who would talk about how painful that was for him to see himself be used in that way. And then I also talked to people who don't know him and would just talk about how frustrating it was to be facing a life sentence and hear this other guy who you've never met, who has nothing to do with you, be used to justify his continued imprisonment without anybody looking at the specifics of his case. But yeah, the bill passed very narrowly, the exact number of votes that it needed. And there was immediately backlash from the community. People were calling lawmakers saying, what about Kip? Is Kip going to get out? And so, in this very kind of hush hush way, lawmakers passed a second bill that kind of amended the first bill to make clear that nobody who was incarcerated before the bill's passage could benefit from the reforms, even if their case did come up for resentencing.
Okay, so this has got to be, it's got to be devastating, one, because I did a little bit of time in jail myself, right? So I always wonder about how Willie Horton must have felt. Yeah, he messed up and he presented them with an opportunity. But inside the jail, I've always wondered how he must have felt as he's living out his life. And I'm wondering, this Kip, how's this? You say it bothers him that he's being used and used against his friends and used against strangers. How is he handling this?
Um, I think he handles it by talking to his friends about it, but I think that the most active way he's chosen to handle it is by speaking out. So for his entire time in prison, or ever since his arrest, he's never spoken to the media. He's never granted a single interview. He's never talked publicly. I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but one key reason is that he felt like it could re-traumatize his victims. Like he had already caused so much harm that he didn't want the people who survived his crime or for the family members of the people he killed to be faced with seeing him and hearing from him. And I think over time, he started to feel like that was still a big priority for him, but he was also seeing how his silence was causing harm. And so he sort of made this calculation where he decided, I do need to speak out. I do need to let people know who I am and why I committed the crime that I did and why, show who I am today and how that's very different than the 15-year-old boy who committed violence. And so I think that for him was sort of a way of seizing control of the narrative. And I think to some extent, I mean, it's too soon to tell, but I think it will be effective. I can't imagine that Kip Kinkel will be a very effective name in Oregon to justify harsh imprisonment of other people, because so many people have read what he has to say now. And it's sort of absurd to read this story and walk away thinking this guy is the poster child for, murderous juveniles who are, unreformable, can never safely be released again. I've heard from people from the community who were in various ways impacted by the crime. And a lot of them told me, I've always had so many questions about this case. It was always clear to me that I wasn't getting the full story. And I had so many questions, and your story answered so much. And, people had various reactions to that. But some people said, I hope he gets out. Like I would live next door to him. Like I don't feel threatened by him.
Okay, yeah, I'm wondering, about his parents. I'm looking at that 9mm Glock, uh, and I'm wondering, as a young teenager, and I don't know. Obviously, the culture of Oregon is different than the culture of inner city Baltimore or someplace, which 9mm Glocks are common, obviously. Uh, but your parents never get them for you, and I'm wondering how to, I mean, once they discovered that he was off on this tantrum of studying, making bombs, accumulating weapons and whatnot, they seem to, I mean, obviously they got him treatment, but they seem to kind of like still allow him to go on like that. Is that my misreading of what happened between him growing up there in that environment and him end up going into that school?
Yeah, I should clarify that I think his parents could tell something was wrong, but they didn't know that he had schizophrenia. They just felt like, oh, he seems pretty into weapons and explosives. But I should also add, I don't think that was incredibly uncommon there. And I think it could be difficult to differentiate between an unhealthy obsession with weapons fueled by a mental illness, and just sort of like boys being into that type of thing. He grew up in a fairly rural part of Oregon where it was very common for boys to have guns, typically more like hunting rifles, I believe, but it wasn't uncommon for someone of his age to be around guns. And my understanding of the way that the Glock entered the picture is that his mother was very concerned when he was getting in trouble. She didn't know the extent, or she didn't know about any of the voices that he was hearing, which were telling him to commit acts of violence. And she didn't know about these delusions that he had. But he was getting in trouble at school. And so she takes him to a therapist. The therapist concludes that he shows no signs of a serious mental illness, thinks that maybe there's some signs of depression, recommends that he gets on Prozac, which he does, but also says that he thinks Kip needs to spend more time with his father and develop a stronger relationship with his father. And one of the activities that he and his father enjoyed doing together was target shooting. And so for Kip, this therapist recommendation provided sort of an opening for him to say, look, the therapist thinks we should spend more time together. Let's go target shooting. And then there's specific guns that are, a hunting rifle isn't great for target shooting. And so that was sort of the way in which he was able to talk his parents into purchasing that Glock. And my understanding is that the Glock was typically locked away and he didn't typically have access to it. But obviously he did on the day of the crime.
Okay, okay, so you spent a lot of time with him in terms of interviews and that kind of stuff. When you walked away and you did this article, what is it you think? And I think you covered a lot of it, but I want you to kind of like encapsulate it. What is it you think that Kip want the public to understand? Uh, why he's speaking out, and what is it he's trying to convey?
I think it's twofold. I think one is all peoples, but specifically juveniles who commit horrific crimes, their capacity for change. And juveniles, I think, we understand to be uniquely capable of change. People who do horrible things when they're kids, that's not necessarily reflective of what they're going to do when they're older. And there's a variety of reasons why kids might commit crime, whether it's an undiagnosed mental illness, an abusive home life, substance abuse problems, poverty, needing to be a part of a gang for a sense of security and stability. So I think partially that, recognizing that people change and showing that he and many people that he's close with have. And I think also showing that it isn't really fair or accurate or sensible to take these really high profile crimes and hold them up as a reason to justify a broader policy, which is something that he saw happen with him in Oregon.
Okay, all right. And I recognize the whole thing about going in the army. You have to be a certain age. The whole thing about drinking, you have to be a certain age. The voting, you have to be a certain age. And so I think society in general recognize that the juvenile brain is not fully formed. The world, the international bodies recognize that. Um, what's your final words on this? You've looked at this case, you've kind of like ripped it apart, you look deep down into it, and you recognize it was one case study of one individual, but you can look at it fully. What's your takeaway from this?
Oh, so many. One, I don't think life without parole is a sensible punishment for anybody, juveniles or adults. I think it sort of gives up the myth that our prison system is supposed to be rehabilitative. I think if you sentence someone to life without parole, you're basically saying that you're hopeless and we don't even want to try to offer you resources to live a more successful life. We just want to throw you away. I don't think that makes sense. I don't think it's just. I think it's particularly outrageous when you do it to somebody who's 15, 16 years old. And I think that there's increasing acknowledgement of that. Um, I think also one lesson that we can take from Kip's case is he got exceptionally good mental health treatment as a kid when he was in juvenile detention. So from the age of 15, or he was after he was sentenced, which I believe he was 17 by the time he got sentenced, he went to a juvenile detention facility and he was there until he was 25, at which point he aged into adult prison. And hearing from him and other people who were at McLaren, this juvenile facility, there was so many more resources geared towards rehabilitation than you would ever see in the typical adult prison. Not only did Kip have access to a psychiatrist that he really trusted, who was very patient with him and worked with him to find a medication that worked well for him and, didn't just make him feel terrible all the time. He also had really intensive therapy. He had almost like group therapy like situations with a lot of other kids who had committed acts of violence. And when you look at Kip, by the time he's 25, I think he emerges in a way that you sort of hope anybody who commits an act of violence will. And then he talks about how when he gets to adult prison, like all that goes away. He and his friends who sort of came up through McLaren and learned all these coping skills together, they worked together to sort of informally carry that on through adult prison, but that wasn't available to them. They did not have those resources. So people who just go straight into adult prison, into this very violent, dehumanizing environment, they just have so little chance to end up doing anything different. And I think that's something that we don't really pay enough attention to. Is we love these success stories of people who go to prison and then they come out better and good. But I don't think we give people enough credit for how much of that is them doing their own work in spite of the conditions in prison. It's not that the prison is the reason that they're being rehabilitated.
Okay, I think that will be the last word. Thank you for joining me, Jessica.
Thanks for having me.
And I will say that was a wonderful, excellent article that you did. You did a great job.
Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Yes. And thanks for bringing this to the public. Yes.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining this episode of Rattling the Bars.